Mary Yaboa. I work for several related organizations, namely Justice for Keith Lamar, based out of Ohio, and I live in Atlanta.
All right, thank you. Grace?
Hi, I'm Grace, and I'm from the University of Arkansas.
All righty, thanks. Wow, people are from all over the place. This is wonderful. Kamana, is that how you say your name?
Yeah, I'm Kamana Okekai Ladig, and I am at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois.
Okay, thank you. Kaylee?
Hi, I'm Kaylee. I'm at the University of Chicago.
Mm-hmm. And Sarah?
I am Sarah. I'm at the University of Florida.
All righty. Stephen?
Steve Sims. I'm actually at LaSalle University now, but my Inside Out course is still with Bridgewater at Plymouth County.
Mm-hmm. All right, good to see you. Ramsey?
I'm Ramsey, and I'm at the University of Arkansas.
Okay, thank you. Megan?
Hi, I'm Megan, and I'm from the University at Buffalo.
Of where?
University at Buffalo.
Okay, thank you. Carl, hi.
Hi, I'm Carl Malofsky. I'm from Bucknell University.
Okay. Ashley? Ashley, are you there?
Yes, I am. I'm so sorry. I have to join on my commute, so I can't manage the video at the moment. But I'm
Okay.
Ashley, and I am at California Lutheran University.
Okay, glad to have you. Sam?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sam. I'm at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I do reentry work in Chicago also.
Okay. Kaylee? Did I get that right?
Hi, it's Kylie, and I'm also
Kylie.
from the University of Arkansas.
Okay, thank you. Sophia?
Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm also at the University of Arkansas.
All right, I see a trend here. I don't know how to say your name, Devon? Is that right? Maybe not. Devon Murray? You there? Okay, we'll come back. Casey?
Hi, my name is Casey. I'm at the University of Arkansas.
Mm-hmm. And I don't have your first name here, but Brannon is your last name? Sydney. Hello, Sydney. And you are from, you told us, the University of Arkansas. Okay. Greg?
Yes, I am Greg. I'm from Pittsburgh. I'm from Duquesne University. I apologize, my camera doesn't work. I'm not being rude. Apologize about that.
Okay.
I have had some social service interactions at a local state prison. I've never been officially a part of Inside Out, but I know some people who are and hope to get more involved with it. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Sabrina?
Hi, I'm Sabrina, and I'm from the University of Arkansas as well.
Alrighty. And Tracy?
I'm sorry, I'm in my car, but I'm in
Okay.
Chicago, and I work at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and we have a program called Beyond Prisons Initiative.
Wonderful.
And we do teach some mixed enrollment classes at Illinois prisons.
All right. Thank you. Faye? I think you just joined.
Yes, thank you.
Where are you from?
Galesburg, Illinois.
Okay. And the last person, and Devon? I guess Devon is not there. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. My internet is unstable. Okay. A senior at the University of Arkansas. And we have one more person joining us right this moment. Abby Shaw. Abby, where are you from?
Hello, me?
Hi.
Oh, hi. I'm Abby. I'm from the University of Arkansas.
Okay, great. All right. And we have Leanne. So Leanne Trapedo Sims is our presenter today. She'll be talking about her kind of project and book, and then we'll move into a conversation. So I have told Leanne that she can introduce herself however she would like. So Leanne, welcome, and the floor is yours.
All right. Hi. Hi, everyone. Lori, thanks so much for giving me this opportunity. I'm Leanne Trapedo Sims, and I'm the Daniel J. Logan Assistant Professor of Peace and Justice at Knox College and chair of the program. And I also am the director of a nascent Knox College Henry Hill Prison Education Program. The prison is about 5 minutes from our liberal arts college. And also, I have been teaching Inside Out. This term will be my third iteration of that. I've taught restorative justice, creative writing, and other subjects. But today I'm going to be speaking about my work in Hawaii. And Lori, I'll ask you to just share the slides. And then when we move from slide to slide, if you will just be able to change them, that would be wonderful. Okay, so if you can share the screen with everyone.
Yeah, hold on one sec. Let's see if we can make this happen. All right. How is that?
Can everybody see that, or is it very tiny?
No, it's fine.
Fine, big enough, right? Because we could full screen it as well, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't know how to full screen it. How do we do that?
Just go slideshow and then go from the beginning, or go slideshow and then play from the beginning.
There we go.
Okay. All right. Anyway, so the subject of my talk today is based upon the work that I did in Hawaii. And the title of my book is called Reckoning with Restorative Justice, Hawaii Women's Prison Writing. And to the left is the image of the book cover that was actually designed by a native Hawaiian artist. And the reason that I called it Reckoning is that I think doing restorative justice work inside prisons is not a simple entity. It has many complicated layers. And, you know, we could even ask, is it possible to do restorative justice work inside? I would say yes, but we can have a conversation about that in a minute. Can you turn to the next slide, Lori?
Yes, remind me how to do that.
Okay, so just go down, like with the little arrows on your thing.
It's not working.
Did you put slideshow, set up slideshow, just go play from start, and then you should be able to just arrow it down?
Is this it?
The next slide is of Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Can folks see that?
Oh, geez. I'm sorry about this. This was at the last minute. Yes, that's what we have.
Okay, you can see that? Okay. All right. So the reason that I'm choosing this is that I want to have a conversation a little bit about abolition versus doing work inside, which some people could think of as reformist work. But I'm putting Ruth Wilson Gilmore because she was one of my teachers, and I wanted us to start this conversation with a quote from her, which says, "Abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions," with the implication that prisons are death-affirming institutions. And then another quote by Mumia Abu-Jamal, who has been on death row in Philadelphia for a very long time. And he wrote, "Abolitionists, simply put, are those beings who look out upon their time and say no." Can you turn to the next slide, Lori?
Here we go.
Okay, so here is a quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore's book. Do you see Golden Gulag? Is that the slide you see, everybody?
Got it.
Yes.
Okay, so Ruthie Wilson Gilmore wrote, "Prisons function not by addressing the poverty, racial and gender oppression, underemployment, despair, and health crises that reproduce prison populations, but by incapacitating targeted populations and blaming them for the very problems that led to their imprisonment." So I just wanted to have that framing of abolition before I talk a little bit about my work. All right, next slide. So I wanted to share some incarceration rates with you. Many of you might be very familiar with this, but this is incarceration in terms of the global context. So the US holds the highest incarceration rate in the world. Only 4% of the world's population lives in the US, but the US accounts for 25% of all imprisoned people. And the US in terms of inside women, and I'll explain a little bit why I use the language of inside and not incarcerated, felon, etc., is that inside women comprise 29% of the world total. So since 2010, women are the fastest growing correctional population, particularly Black women, to be entering into the carceral space. So Hawaii's incarceration rate, as we see to the left, is higher than all but 5 foreign countries. Lori, can we have the next slide? So in Hawaii, there's an overrepresentation of indigenous Hawaiians, or Kanaka, Kanaka Maoli, Kanaka or Iwi. Kanaka Maoli means Native Hawaiian. Kanaka or Iwi literally means people of the bones. So although they represent only 24% of the state's population, Native Hawaiians comprise 41% of the population in state prisons. And for women, that's even higher. It's equal to about 44%. All right, next slide. Okay, so just to quickly also speak a little bit about the PIC, or the Prison Industrial Complex. This is from Critical Resistance, the work they did in the 90s. The Prison Industrial Complex is a term that describes the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. Can we have the next slide? So a little bit about language. What you call us matters, right? So I was fortunate to train in the Walls to Bridges program in 2015 in Canada with Simone Val Davis, and then later with Lori through the Inside Out program. But when I was at a women's prison in Kitchener, Ontario, one of the women said to me, please don't call us prisoners, offenders, felons, or convicts. That language really serves to reduce us to one of the worst things we've done in our lives. And sometimes we haven't done those things because there are many innocent people in the prison. So since then, and through my training too with Inside Out, I like to use the language of inside person. Okay, next slide. So through my work, I've been thinking about these dual locations that I occupy, and I've been thinking about the debate or the divide between abolition or reform. So there is a complexity in occupying these dual locations, being an abolitionist and doing work inside prisons. So some theorists, particularly through the American Studies Association, will envision work connected to the carceral space as an extension of state violence, what I call sort of the ideologues, like the abolitionist ideologues. But yet inside students attest to the power of transformational programming. So I think it's important for us to reflect on ways in which transformation can be co-opted by or deeply embedded in notions of rehabilitation, treatment, and control, which are all carceral logics. And this was written by 2 Inside scholars, Castro and Gold, in 2018. What I have come to find is that work with inside people, whether it's through education, trauma-informed care, restorative justice, reentry work, to the extent feasible in a carceral setting, is not inconsistent with the ongoing struggle for abolition. And I would give a shout out to the folks in Chicago, like the Prison Neighborhood Arts Project, who do this work, abolitionist work inside. Can we have the next slide, Lori? Sorry, I have to catch up with you. Okay, so these were some of what I called anxious questions that framed the work that I did in Hawaii. I lived in Hawaii for about 12 years. I went to the University of Hawaii, Manoa, where I got my doctoral degree in the American Studies programs. So this is something that I started to think about. How does pua honua, and I'll speak a little bit about what pua honua is, distilled maybe to an equivalent of site of refuge. How does pua honua depart from other praxis of restorative justice? What are the contradictions of doing feminist ethnography in carceral spaces? Because this is what I considered my work to be, was feminist ethnography, although that was quite convoluted as well. How does restorative justice operate in oppressive landscapes? And what are the power and limits of restorative justice praxis, both inside and outside of prison? So I'll just give you a little bit of my introduction to my book. Was called The American Gulag and Indigenous Incarceration in Hawaii. So I borrowed from Ruth Wilson Gilmore there. So this image is of one of the oldest pua honuas, and it is in the island of Hawaii, or Hawaii Island. Sometimes people colloquially call it Big Island. So, oh, sorry, Lori, did you go to that slide? I forgot to tell you the introduction to the American Gulag. Did you show that slide? Oh, hello? Hello? Oh, you guys can all see that? Okay. All right. Sorry. Okay. So next slide is what was the Pua Honua. So I came to see the Pua Honua and also through talking to the warden at the women's prison in Hawaii, Mark Kavika Patterson, who was Native Hawaiian, and I'll speak a little bit about his work. But the Pua Honua was a marked space. And in ancient times, when a Native Hawaiian or Kanaka Maoli committed a crime, they could go to the Pua Honua, and there they could convene with their kumus and the kapunas, their teachers and their elders, and they could arrive at a space of restorative justice. Then once that was done, they could return back to the community for the gifts that they brought. And so we can think of the Pua Honua as a space of restoration. Laurie, next slide. So the history of Hawaii in brief, all right? And this is really to distill it down very much, but the narrative of U.S. empire is directly connected with Hawaii. So in 1893, Hawaii was illegally overthrown, Queen Liliuokalani's monarchy, and we see Queen Liliuokalani to the left, by settlers in the U.S. government. Hawaiian was banned between 1893 to 1986, which was considered a linguicide. In the 70s, there was the resurgence of Hawaiian immersion language schools vis-a-vis Kamehameha and cultural practices such as hula halals and oli'i, chants, genealogy. And also there's the resistance of the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, which is very strong today vis-a-vis Mauna Kea. Laurie, can we have the next slide? So as I mentioned before, although they represent only 24% of the state population, Native Hawaiian men comprise about 38% and Native Hawaiian women 44% of the prison population. So here we see in Hawaii that the incarceration in Hawaii is an extension of colonialism. This overrepresentation follows a genealogy of discrimination against Indigenous people, both in the nation and also transnationally. Kanaka Maoli in Hawaii are more likely to get diabetes, receive inferior education, face houselessness, and suffer from the collateral ailments of poverty. In fact, Native Hawaiians constitute about 60% of the state's indigent population living on beaches and sidewalks, and the activists in the Hawaiian sovereignty movement witness these devastations as a continuation of colonialism, or what is called the perennial occupation. Can we have the next slide? So my work in terms of carceral writing interrogates the intersections of gender, indigeneity, violence, and state power in colonized Hawaii. I became to see through my research and reading and speaking to people that carceral writing can be read as diasporic in itself, a writing of exile. So two people that influenced me highly was the Indigenous critical prison scholar, Leoana Ross, who has done very interesting work on a prison out west near her reservation, and Canadian scholar Dina Rhymes, who both explore the pain of carceral exile for marginalized communities already in exile. All right, next slide. So based upon the work that I did for my doctoral work at the Seoul Women's Prison in Hawaii called Women's Community Correctional Center, my book was published with Duke University Press in September 2023. And prior to that, I had written an article called Love Letters, Performative and Biological Families, which was the 4th chapter of my book, and it was published in Frontiers, a journal of women's studies, special issue, Mapping Gendered Violence, Contemplating Conflict and Crisis in Contemporary Societal Struggles. And then I wrote another article called Reimagining Home, Redemption and Resistance in Hawaii Women's Prison Writing, which was published in Science, one of the leading feminist journals in 2020. So a little bit about my personal experience. As I said to you before, I considered my work to be feminist ethnography. I did work at the Seoul Women's Prison in Kailua, Oahu, between 2012 to 2016. So it was site-specific feminist ethnography that took place over a long period of time. I interviewed many of the inside women and had access to these interviews through the warden, Kavika Patterson, who was very supportive of my project. I was able to participate in the Kailua Prison Writing Project and the Prison Monologues, which I'll speak a little bit about, between 2012 to 2015. And I also got to teach creative writing in the prison from 2015 to 2016. So to the left, we'll see the cover of the Hula Hia journal, and Hula Hia in Hawaiian means transformation. That cover was designed by one of the Inside Women, and just as many prisons across the nation, there are very many talented artists and writers inside the prison. With the titling of the journal as Hula Hia, it showed the woman that directed the program, Pat Clough, her idea that creative writing was about transformation. All right, next slide. So a little bit about WCCC. As I said, it's the only women's prison on the island of Oahu in Honolulu. And the facility houses pretrial and sentenced female offenders. I'm using these words in quotation to interrogate the Department of Corrections language, because I don't like to think of prisons as homes for anyone. And so to use the more accurate language was that WCCC warehouses 300 women of mixed security levels. All right, next slide. So a little bit about Kanaka Maoli women. The violence that they experience is part of an indigenous dispossession under settler colonial regime that is an ongoing form of domination. And here's some statistics that a woman at WCCC is more likely to report childhood and sexual victimization, 60%, experience some violence in her life, 80%, have a history of substance abuse, 95%, have a history of mental health problems, 33%, and be the mother of at least one child. So one thing that the warden said to me, that he came from a place of, he had only worked with men. And he said when he got the job as warden at the women's prison, he actually was quite nervous because he said he had never worked with women before on that scale. And he said when he came in and he looked around him and he saw the profound trauma and suffering and drug addiction, he realized he had to have another way to reach the women in his care. So we can kind of see by the statistics that it's really about a particularly gendered trauma. And I think this kind of statistics sort of mirror statistics also on the continent or in the nation. So Inside Women share significant histories of physical and sexual abuse, but there's a dearth of programming, funding, research for and about women. So many people will make the argument, well, that the prison is still very much a male-inflected space. But as I said in the beginning, that women are the fastest population to enter prison today. Are we on that slide with the gender trauma? Okay. Inside women experience mental health problems at rates significantly higher than inside men, but yet there's an over-medication, ready access to psychotropics. So when I would arrive at the prison to teach, there would always be a long line of women waiting for their psychotropic medication. And I spoke to many women in interviews, and some of the women told me, that they could not get medicine for their cardiac health or for their thyroid issues, but both antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication was really pushed upon them. I have not seen that in the work that I've done at Henry Hill Correctional Facility, but perhaps the men just do not speak about that, but I have not witnessed that. I came to see the types of trauma that many of the women that I interviewed spanned across personal trauma, intergenerational trauma, familial trauma, institutional trauma, and for Native Hawaiian women, colonial trauma. Can we have the next slide? Can I just ask, are we on the Ho'oponopono slide? Are people following that? Because I can't really see where we are with the slideshow.
Yes.
Yes, we are.
All right, great. Okay, so Ho'oponopono, what that means at the root of that Hawaiian word is pono, which means righteousness, right? So the classical or the historical definition of Ho'oponopono is correct mental cleansing, family conferences in which relationships were set right through prayer, discussion, confession, repentance, and mutual restitution and forgiveness. So kind of equal to maybe restorative justice. But yet it is very problematic to collapse indigenous models of Ho'oponopono with Christian modality of forgiveness and reconciliation. And Native Hawaiians today are contesting the cultural appropriation of Ho'oponopono in restorative justice circles, and particularly outside of Hawaii. So I went to the Justice Summit last year in Hawaii, and many people were speaking about this sort of commodification and appropriation of Ho'oponopono outside of Hawaii. All right, next slide, please. So here is the warden to the right. So here is Mark Kavita Patterson. I don't think you can see this, but Warden Patterson always wore a big gold cross. So then we can kind of talk a little bit about the complicatedness of that as Native Hawaiian, but also indebted to Christianity. His brother is actually much more of an activist than him, and he works with the Hawaiian sovereignty movement. But Kavika Patterson had some very, very generative ideas about prisons. And in fact, at the Justice Summit, he publicly said, we need to decarcerate. And I was active for a while on the moratorium to close out prison buildup in Hawaii, and he sits as one of the top members of that council. So he's pretty progressive as far as wardens go, I would say. So he implemented inventive Indigenous program in the prison, and he began the Trauma-Informed Care Initiative in 2008, which uses the framework of an Indigenous pua honua. Can we have the next slide, please? So here were some of the things that he brought to the prison. He had what we called huikahi restorative justice circles, and I was able to sit in on some of those circles. My friend and colleague, who is a lawyer, Lauren Walker, who ran the Justice Summit in Hawaii, led some of these circles. Also, women were able to bring their life story maps in front of the parole board. There was a translation of the turn of the century newspapers from Hawaiian to English for the native Hawaiian speakers. And there's a really good book called Aloha Betrayed that I could recommend to you by Noe Silva, who is in the political science department of the UH Manoa, who wrote really interesting work about that issue. And also one of the women was able to teach hula on the prison. And then there was the planting of lo'i fields with indigenous plants such as taro and kalo, which we see to the right. Okay, next slide, please. I also just wanted to say, I don't want to say that like the work that he was doing was like utopic work, because some of the women were critical and felt like the reason that he was sort of positing the prison as a pua honua was complicated. It could be for garnering funds. Also, he was critiqued by the Office of Hawaiian Affairs for positing the prison as a pua honua, a sacred space in a prison, which was really a non-sacred space. Eventually, he was either let go from the women's correctional community, and he took over work at the youth correctional facility, where he actually has done pretty incredible and transformative work. He had promised that he would get the population of girls at the youth correctional facility down to 0, and he did accomplish that. Okay, next slide on pedagogy and process. That was my first chapter when I talked a little bit about the pedagogy of Pat Clough, because I visited her class. And here in the yard, we see the women. This is before the Prison Monologues was formed, where the women would share their stories with their peers. And this is how it began. And I can speak a little bit more about the origin. Can we go to the next slide? So this is a little bit about the Kailua Prison Writing Project. We see Pat Clough to the right with 3 of the women. By 2003, the Kailua Prison Writing Project began in 2003 and went till about 2013. It reached about 600 women. The Hula Here, the Transformation Journal, was published bi-yearly. And this is a quote by Pat Clough. She said that the KPWP is a vehicle for learning that replaces traumatic history and a believable future, and is a direct antidote to recidivism. All right, can we go to the next slide? So through my work, through observing the classes and through teaching my own classes, I came to understand that writing and performance were types of pua honua. So the expressivity that I saw that the women shared in class, which was very, very powerful. So for example, when one of the women was sick and couldn't come to the class, her peer would come to the class to read her poem to make sure her voice was heard. So this expressivity counters the demarcation of a civic debt that many prisoners are sort of assigned to. This is something that I see in Henry Hill too with the creative writing classes, and that the KPWP served as a vital resource for the inside woman, but yet it also remained deeply embedded within carceral logics at the institutional, state, and federal levels. So I'll give a quick example of that. So for example, both Kavika Patterson and Pat Clough chose which women were allowed to join the Prison Monologues, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and go out into the community and perform their work. But there was some censorship involved. So for example, some of the women would write about their wives in the prison. Those poems were not selected to be published in Hulahia. And when I asked the warden about that, he just said, well, no one should be having personal relationships in the prison because it's a time to work on oneself. So I just wanted to share that as an example. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this image was done by an artist in the island of Hawaii, Dietrich Vasquez. And this image was of Hina, the goddess. And this image, this woodcut, was present in the classroom. So even though
my reading came directly from my reading.
Hello? Okay. Anyways, even though I talked a little bit about the fact that the women would share the work, and I came to see this community as a community of sacred writers, I did think that this puahonua was troubled, obviously, by the institutional intrusions. So the constraints of prison life always came into the classroom. And so I wrote about how the carceral narrative infected or inflected the pedagogical space. So Lori, can you do the next slide, which says Kelly's poem? This is a poem written by Kelly, and she wrote, "A child waiting to sneak up on a butterfly, finding our own truth, intimidation of authority, an honest assessment of the disaster that remains of what's left." And one day Kelly was reading this poem, and this is very serendipitous. At the same time, a guard was dragging a woman in an orange jumpsuit. She was shackled both by belly chains and leg chains across the vision of our classroom. So that is an example of how the carceral space always intruded. Or if the women had to be called out to the parole board and they would re-enter the class, sometimes, crying because things didn't go well. So there was always that idea. Or when the loudspeaker was always blaring, you could never understand it. It was always incomprehensible. And we were having a really great conversation and women were called out to the head count. This happened, very frequently. All right. Could we go to the next slide? So the subject of my second chapter was about home. So Pat Clough in Hulahia, one of the journals was, she had sent out these prompts for women to write about what does home mean to them? What does homeland mean to them? And then to the right, we can see the image of the Kualau Mountains that actually surround the prison, right? So the poems about home, to me, served as a political tool to counter the experience of dispossession in the carceral space. And home appeared as a site of trauma, a site of fantasy and desire, even within the notion of the KPWP itself as home, a site of healing. The polyvocal poems repelled reductive notions of home and emancipatory narratives, and the woman's critique lives in the missions and counter-performativity of their writing. So sometimes, political things would sneak in about home and homeland that were really interesting. And I wanted to share Tiffany's poem. Could we go to the next slide? So Tiffany, who was a very critical writer, wrote this poem called "Where is Home?" And Tiffany had spent some time in New York, so you will hear this referenced here. "My transient home, a metal drawer, it screeches beneath me, a metal lock to guard the safety of the few belongings I still own. Is my home really this place? The sickness of insanity, a revolving door of recidivism? This is no New York City penthouse. That one over there is a gatekeeper, not your doorman. I see it everywhere, the comfortable, the complacent. She'll sing the Batu blues without a care. She's been given a bed and 3 meals. Grandma soothes and rocks her babies to sleep in a lonely corner of this island." Next slide. "This is the land of the lost. Where is home? I will not always be a wanderer, unsuccessful at my attempts to create a sanctuary, the place I yearn for, all that home has promised to be, pretty pictures in a magazine. I am discovering the haven I seek. I am still seeking me. Home will reveal itself. The more I find myself, the more I realize that I'll be home when I'm being me." And so just to say a little bit about Batu, Batu is just a local word for meth. And Hawaii has one of the worst meth problems in the country. So life writing performed as a diasporic document, a stateless location from which women who wrote about the I perform a multiplicity of identities. That diasporic document is even more crippling when marked by the space of diaspora, the homelessness of the prison industrial complex. Recording trauma is complicated, particularly for marginalized writers who are dispossessed of a legitimate status due to gender, race, and sexuality. And then I wanted to just end this home section with one poem that Jennifer wrote. Everyone at home has gotten used to having me away with 13 years of prison time. There's not much I can say. The reality of my life today, I made all on my own. If I could have changed one thing in life, I would have stayed home. The next chapter I moved into was called The Stage Away from the Page, which talks a little bit about the prison monologues. And here we see the woman, oh, sorry, Laurie, are you on the slide that says The Stage Away from the Page? Of the women sitting on the stools performing at a high school. So the prison monologues, Laurie, can we have next slide, was born out of the creative writing classes. It began in 2008. And this was when some of the best writers were chosen, both by the warden and Pat Clough, to leave the prison and go out to high schools, to universities like Chaminade universities, but not only that, to national conferences. So the women would perform at the ACLU. There were a lot of people in attendance, maybe like 400, at the Office of Youth Services, at the Hawaii State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, at the Pacific Rim International Conference on Disability and Diversity, and at the Ahevahine Conference, which was a gathering of Native Hawaiian women from the community. And this, to the right, was called Writings from Prison Conversations with Myself. Can we have the next slide? So these performances were really, really powerful. Pat Clough actually developed what was like a tripartite schema. And the woman wrote about, like, who was I before I came to prison? Who am I now? And their letters back home. So they would have auditions on Saturdays. I went to several of the auditions. And the women that served to be the core monologue performers were very instrumental in choosing which women could come in. And I interviewed many of them. Some of them said, you know, they originally just joined the program because they wanted to get out of the prison and eat good food. But I think it was really powerful for them to go to these communities, and especially to go to the communities and reach teenagers who came from similar locations to them. It was a very powerful kind of performance. And I remember even at a high school, I think there were 800 people in attendance. Like I would often see these young men, like with their baseball caps, like drawn down across their eyes, like crying, because they really had this purchase or the power to move people. I saw about 40 of these performances and they never failed to move me. So I wrote a little bit about the monologues were kind of like testimony, and there was a slippage between performativity and life writing. There was definitely a model of reform behind the Prison Monologues project. So for example, Warden Kavika Patterson got a lot of attention in the press about the prison monologues. There was the quandary of redemption that was sponsored by the state as both censoring and productive. And I thought a lot about Gillian Whitlock's work and the tensions in that, which names the sacred nature of testimony and the commodification and consumption of testimonial discourse. Can we have the next slide? The love letters. So the love letters were actually like one of my favorite chapters to work on. The warden granted me permission to go into his office. He had this big core table in his office, and to read 60 of the letters that the teenagers wrote back to the women after they visited this school. So they had a very close relationship with two schools, Nanakuli High School and Kapolei High School, in which they would go back maybe several times a year. Laurie, can we have the next slide that says restorative dialogue? So when I went in and I read these 60 love letters, what I called love letters, where the students wrote back to the women, I really saw what was at work was restorative dialogue. So these participatory performative dialogic between the prison monologues and the students at Nanakuli and Kapolei High School. The students' life writing texts were direct responses to narratives of memory, pain, and abuse of the inside women. And I came to see this dialogue as a native Hawaiian epistemology. So I witnessed how avenues in which trauma itself performs as the dialogic, and I came to see how pain is sutured and testimony is restorative because of its corroborating live audience, which was not present in chapter 2 when I wrote about the home dialogues. Could we go to the next one? So one thing that was interesting, I went to this performance at Bobby Benson, which was a residential program on the West Side. And one time, like after the presentation, one young a young woman or high school student rushed one of the prison monologues women and like hugged her, and they both cried. And she said, "Do you know my mom?" And often the women would become like witnesses to the teenagers who had lost their mothers to the carceral state. So it became like a very interesting sort of conversation, a very moving conversation, when sometimes the students in their love letters to the woman would pick a particular woman and sort of bond with her. So there was one woman, Joanne, who was Samoan. When we went out, many of the Samoan students right after the performance would rush Joanne and have a lot of questions for her. So it was a powerful kind of bonding. Anyways, here at the very end on this post-release and effective writers, that was my last slide, we see Kimi Takata. Kimi was in prison. She had a very long sentence, 30 to life. And then Kimi had actually tried to escape from the prison and cut through the gate. And so her prison sentence was extended. She always seemed like she wore a mask. She was always like seemed very sad, very angry about her past. She had a really difficult past, one of incest. And she told me, and here we see her with Warden Kavika Patterson, that the warden actually saved her life. The warden would send her notes that said, "Kimi, I see you." And basically, Kimi's sentence was reduced by the former governor, Neil Abercrombie, and Kimi is now on the outside. And here we see Kimi at her graduation with the warden, Kavika Patterson. She graduated from Chaminade University with a double major. Okay. And then I just wanted to end. I'm not going to play this film for you. If we could go to the next slide, Laurie, that says Crisis in Deportation to the Continent. This is a really great film that I would like to recommend to folks by Kiera Lacey, who's native Hawaiian. It's called Out of State. And 1/3 of Hawaii's more than 6,000 inmates, this is from their publicity, are transferred to private prisons in the mainland, which is run by CoreCivic Corporation. Segura Correctional Center, which is a private prison for men located in Arizona, is one of the largest recipients for Native Hawaiian men, and the prison contracts with the Hawaii Department of Public Safety. There's been a lot of literature that has been written, basically that Hawaii as a state saves money when they send people from the inside out of state, like per day, the beds are much cheaper, but it really poses a further problem of exile because people can't afford to go visit their family and their loved ones in Arizona. And this film poignantly depicts about how Native Hawaiian men go to this prison in the middle of the desert, and there's Native Hawaiian programming for them. So here we see them doing hula halau, and they talk about how they learned how to be Native Hawaiian in a prison in the middle of the Arizona desert. So it's a really wonderful film that I would like to recommend to you. Okay, I don't know how much time I have. Do I have a few minutes? I just talk a little bit about the work I'm doing in Illinois, or should we go to question and answers?
We have another half an hour. And so if you want to take another, say, 5 minutes or so, can you do it in 5 minutes and then?
Sure. All right. Okay. So next slide. I just wanted to share like the racial disparity in Illinois, because this is the state that I'm working in. So that Black people constitute about 15% of Illinois residents, but 49% of people in jail and 56% of people in prison are Black. I would say from the work that I'm doing at Henry Hill Correctional Center, those numbers are underreported, and it's much higher in terms of Black and brown people inside. I found some interesting research about the pandemic that inside people were granted early release from Illinois prisons at the onset of the pandemic, and those that were granted that were mostly white. So I just wanted to share that with you. So can we go to the next slide, Laurie, where it says Knox Hill program? So I began the Inside Out Prison Exchange program at the Henry C. Hill Correctional Center. It's a medium security for about 1,500 men. It's in Galesburg, very near the Knox campus. And this is an opportunity for Knox students and inside men to study as peers behind prison walls. I won't talk to you too much about Inside Out because many of you know about this, but it's an opportunity to dismantle hierarchies between the inside students and students in the free world. And to the right, we see an artwork that was done by Addison Anderson, which is one of the Knox students. I started this creative writing zine at Henry Hill that is an extended conversation between the inside men and Knox students, both that come into the Inside Out class, but even to the larger Knox student body. Can we have the next slide, Laurie? So I just wanted to let you see the cover of the zine. It's called Reflections Across Borders. This was designed by one of my outside students, Lee Buell. And this is a little bit about the work that I've been doing at Hill. Also, some of the students went to the National Peace and Justice Studies Conference in Iowa last year to talk about the work that they've been doing through Inside Out. And then if you can go to the last slide, this was just some of the students from Knox that talked a little bit about, their responses. So we can see Izzy says, I entered the course aware of my privileged background, having never spoken with a person who's incarcerated. I've never been in a classroom setting where I felt so challenged. I felt connected to the inside students and walked away with an experience unlike anything else at Knox. And then Josh Carlos said, my experience in this course has been my most significant opportunity at Knox so far. Nothing has changed my worldview as much as this. And then we had a student from Japan, Uzumi, who participated with us, that wrote, learning from this perspective is something you really get in life. And then we see this image by Addison Anderson that responded to Emmett X's poem, American Made. All right, and then I think that's it. And then also, I just wanted to give a shout out that some of the men participated in the recent Incarcerated Scholars Conference, sponsored by the Alliance for Higher Education in Prison. 990 people attended that conference, and people from, it was all incarcerated scholars as far as South Africa, Argentina, and Brazil were present. And I was able to go to the prison like 2 Wednesdays ago, where the men heard their work being read by the main fellows. And I know it was very powerful and moving for them. We talked about that today. Yeah. So I think that's it. We can move to Q&A. And let me go back to my screen. Okay.
So what kinds of questions do people have? Observations, insights, anything that that came up during that really quite fabulous and very full presentation. I appreciate that. And I'm wondering too, if there are any students here who have taken part in Inside Out, if you'd want to share any insights as well.
Hi, Leanne. First of all, mahalo nui loa for doing this research and for sharing this book. It is really, really, really important. I was really interested in the way that you framed writing of exile as kind of this diasporic literature, and I was wondering if you have done any kind of cross-analysis between diasporic literature and literature done by formerly incarcerated or incarcerated peoples in Hawaii.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I mean, Kamana's from Hawaii, right? Your family's from Hawaii. So, I didn't speak a little bit about this, but, racial sort of categorization in Hawaii is very complex, right? So even though, I was giving those statistics about Native Hawaiians, there were several women in my class that did not identify as being only Native Hawaiian because they were Samoan Hawaiian or Chinese Hawaiian or Filipino Hawaiian. So those categories, it's also about the way people choose to declare themselves, right? So I think there has been a lot more literature. In fact, I'm working with a woman right now who does work a lot in diasporic literature from the space of Australia. And also there's a lot that has been written, I think, in terms of Maori writing in New Zealand. But I haven't done a lot of research around that. So that is something that I would be interested in doing further. But I just saw that especially through that home and homeland, like the longing for the lost homeland was so powerful and central to these poems. Like even people that had been, like maybe we could say like very colonized, right? Or even people that didn't consider themselves to be Native Hawaiian, but had some Native Hawaiian family members would use Hawaiian language in their poems, right? So the way that sort of peppered or infiltrated their poetry, or even if we started to speak about ideas, right? And and I also, I had white women, I had a Black woman in my class. So it definitely wasn't like I only had Native Hawaiian women, but the way that particularly Native Hawaiian women spoke about home, was different. And also, unfortunately, this was something that the warden spoke a lot about. I could recommend this TED Talks where he talks about the prisoners of Pua Honua. It's actually called Can Prison Be a Healing Space? He says in this interview that one of the greatest shames is incest, right? So if we think about like how many, and I spoke to some of the women that were Native Hawaiian, some of them were incest survivors, right? And what a painful story, what a painful narrative, what a painful history that is completely connected, I think, to colonization, right? We can see those types of narratives, I think, in Indigenous communities on the here in the US, right? And Luana Ross writes a little bit about that when she does this analysis of both the pathways that Native Hawaiian find themselves in when they come to prison, and she did this comparative study, and white women, and those pathways are very, very different. But colonization is central to this, right? To these devastations.
Thank you for answering. I noticed very similar themes in ethnographical research that I was doing with diasporic Hawaiians, so I thought that was particularly interesting. Thank you for answering.
Do you want to say more about that? That would be fascinating if you want to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, totally. So my research that I've been doing is a project on diaspora and connection to the greater Hawaiian community. This project in particular was focusing on hula as a vessel for connection and how the lack of hula on the continents has created this sort of abstraction of identity and abstraction of that idea of homeland. Something that I wish that I did a little bit more research on was the concept of homeland. How a lot of the local Kanaka Maoli, the people who live on the islands, told me that people in diaspora, our homeland is still in Hawaii, but every single diasporic Kanaka Maoli I talked to said that they didn't feel like they deserved to call that their homeland, or that they didn't feel like they felt too disconnected to feel comfortable with saying it was where they were from. And that ancestral tie still technically exists, but isn't something that they feel comfortable with acknowledging. So I thought that was really sad, but very interesting.
Right, or even the way that people will talk about the continent as the mainland. Remember what Hina Leomwana Wangkalu said, that's not the mainland. That's, when she was talking about that. I also recommend a really great poet. This is for everyone who's a friend of mine. And if you do go to Hawaii, Brandy Nalani McDougall, who is Native Hawaiian Maui poet, has written very poignantly about this in her new book, Birthland. So I can share that with you as well. So Brandy's poems address this notion of sort of diasporic exile.
Other thoughts, other questions?
I have a question. I'm wondering if you could speak more to the tension you had in kind of the abolitionist and reformist kind of tendencies. I experienced a similar.
Sorry, I didn't hear you because I got cut off. Can you say that again?
Sure.
Sorry, I got kicked out.
I can try. So before I did my inside out training, I was doing this kind of mental dance between, kind of working in the system to transform the system, and my kind of abolitionist tendencies versus reformist tendencies. And I came to the conclusion that I'm not going to abolish the system. Me not going in and teaching is not going to do anything to abolish the system, but me going in and teaching can be transformative. So I'm just wondering kind of what your thought process was like.
Yeah. Honestly, I was shamed at a big conference, in the American Studies conference. I'll just say this by a very famous scholar who basically, when I said about the work that I'd done in Hawaii, was that's just you extending this, both the settler state, as well as working with state violence. So I really think in the beginning, I was very intimidated by this because I was new to the field and this person was really famous. So it was humiliating. But I don't care about that anymore, right? It's just what you say. I know, and also through Lori's work, which I'm extremely indebted to, I know I make a difference. I mean, there are days that are really terrible inside. I have men in Illinois in my class who are not getting out. I have one student in particular, brilliant poet. He has been in since he was 18 years old. He's 50 now. He practices his yoga every single day. He does his breath. He mentors the other men. He's incredible. Like, let's talk about like restorative justice and all the work he's done on himself. For some reason, he's not getting out, right? So when we talk about this, we also have to think, and in Illinois in particular, it's death by incarceration. These men are getting 80 to 60 to 80-year sentences for something that they did when they were not juveniles, like where their brains were not even fully formed. This is in America, right? Let's talk about apartheid. Let's talk about the atrocities of those types of sentences. So, you know, people that are committed to abolition in an ideological way that don't even go into prisons, who cares what they say? I don't care what they say anymore. So I just really, yeah, I think you can make a difference. It's not gonna, you know, I don't know. I just think this work is so important. Just showing up and going in there, you know. Yeah.
Mhm.
Sorry if that seemed incendiary, but I'm tired of that. Like, you're extending the state, you know. It's actually a position of privilege. I really have come to see that, you know. Yeah.
Explain that a little bit more. It is a position of privilege in what
Or
way?
to say that I'm an abolitionist and I'm not going in because I don't want to extend the state's reach. Like, I don't want to participate with state violence, right? That takes a lot of privilege because you're not in there every day, 23 to 24 hours a day in your cell. So then you can afford to say that. And it's a privileged position, I think.
Well said. Any other thoughts or questions?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for this presentation and for this opportunity. I learned so much. I was kind of very interested in some of the tensions you began your presentation with, including the layers and the complexities of restorative justice work, especially in either comparison or contrast to the Indigenous Hawaiian sort of ways of repairing harm. So I was wondering if you could just go a little bit deeper on maybe the limits of restorative justice. I think it's connected to what we're talking about, abolitionists versus revisionists and so on. And the reason I'm asking is I'm currently working in an alternative high school in the district that I live in, and they go home every day. So I'm also playing a lot around ideas of home and land and belonging, but that's too much for this question. Doing restorative justice in these spaces, I'm interested in learning more about the complexities and the layered nuances of when and to what extent it's useful. Those are the ideas I'm sort of pushing back on and problematizing while doing restorative justice work in these semi-carceral spaces.
So that's a good question. I was also, okay. All right. So I didn't speak about this a lot, and I should have. Is that also I was a white person, like doing this work. That is very complicated, right? Too, like sitting in, I had to think about like my own positionality as somebody that was a guest there, you know, not born in Hawaii, lived there for 12 years. But, you know, that was complicated in itself. I do want to share like an interesting story. So like Pat Clough would teach there, and the literature, the archive that she used, also for Native Hawaiian women, Pacific Islander women, and white women, for all the people, she used a very white archive. So she often would teach like Hemingway and Frank, you know, and I'm like, what's up with all this literature? Like, why is she not really using like more indigenous Native Hawaiian writers? Actually, we talked about this. So one time when I had never taught in a prison before, she was sick and she said, can you please teach my class for me today? And I actually was nervous because I'd never taught in a prison before. So I was like, okay, I'm going in. I'm going to bring Hanani K. Trask's work, right? And Hanani K. Trask is one of the leading sovereignty, really political person who wrote, you know, from a native daughter. So I brought Hanani's work into the class. And one of the poets in the class, who was a woman from the island of Hawaii, Hawaii Island, she was a bus driver. She said, you know what? I really prefer Hemingway to Hanani K. Trask. Trask is so angry. I really can't like relate to her work. You know, we could talk about, well, is that sort of because she was like colonized or not, but she said, I just don't like her work. And I also made my living by being a bus driver. So I came to think about like maybe my position was really privileged. Like I went in armed with Hananike Trast's work, and not all the women liked Trast. Some of the women did, but also we shouldn't like presuppose what our students might like or might not like. But also in terms of restorative justice, I've been thinking it more with the men at Hill than I did in this class, because I didn't teach as long in the women's prison as I have taught now in Illinois. But, the president of Knox College came to my last Inside Out class, and he's a Black man, right? And he said to me, I don't really believe that you can do restorative justice work inside. Like he did say that to me. And I've been thinking a lot about that. And maybe so, because as I've said to you before, like a lot of the men will not go home. Like, I also had to think a little bit about the texts that I wanted to bring in. I wanted to bring Danielle Sared's work in on restorative justice. The prison wouldn't let me bring that in. They said she mentions abolition and they don't feel comfortable with me bringing in a text that speaks about abolition. But in our own time, and we don't have a CO in there, we talk about abolition all the time. The men are very political. They will say, we have been in one plantation to the next. They will name that, right? So there's nothing that I can teach them about that. They know way more than me, but, we looked at Trevor Noah's work, and they were able to see the parallels between Truth and Reconciliation in Soweto, Trevor's life growing up in Soweto, compared to their lives growing up in Chicago. There were similarities, the same economic apartheid, right? So I don't know, to me, I think it's about having good conversations, building trust, building community, and then you can do restorative justice inside. But there are limits.
Thank you. That's helpful. I was thinking about maybe the word I might use is you can't do necessarily do transformative justice in cooperation with, although that's probably a contested idea too. But I think you can do restorative justice anywhere harm is being done, meaning anywhere people are, no matter what space you're in. But again, your answer is very helpful for helping me think through these things at a deeper level. So thanks.
I'd love to have a further conversation with you about your work. Feel free to email me anytime if you want to meet on Zoom or something. I'd love to hear about your work.
Leanne, do you want to put your email address in the chat?
Sure.
Okay. Other thoughts, other questions? We can hear you typing.
I know, one finger at a time. Okay, I'm bad at technology.
We got it. So I have a question, Leanne. So thinking back to your work in Hawaii and thinking about your work in Illinois, what are some of the commonalities that you find and some of the differences?
Okay, so just to be really honest, like I had only done work in a women's prison before, taught in a women's or facilitated in a women's prison. I was a little bit nervous about doing work in a male correctional facility. And this is for some of the reasons that some of my students have mentioned, even my Knox class. So this year in my Knox class, I teach prison education, a practicum that prepares students to go inside the term before they go inside, right? And some people have been harmed by violence. So the idea of sexual violence comes up a lot for women, right? And so, this was something that I thought about before I went in. How would I feel like if I knew that many of the men in my class had done a lot of sexual violence? Like I'm just giving that as an example. So I was a bit nervous, but I honestly have found it easier to teach or facilitate in the male facility in terms of both classroom management, respect. I don't know, it's less emotional. And I know this might sound like a horrible gender binary, but I really feel like in the women's prison, things would spill out a lot, like a lot of people's personal stories. It was messier. I don't know. It's been a very different environment working with the men, and I love the work that I'm doing here in Illinois. But, I did go back to Hawaii for the Justice Summit, and I went in with somebody who's also a visionary, Rob Chang, who does amazing work at Halawa Prison. And I went with him to a few of his classes, and I noticed that sort of spilling out was present there. So maybe this is just a cultural thing. People are more I don't know, sort of family oriented. Things are a little bit more less formal in Hawaii. So there is a different feeling, a different cultural feeling, definitely from being in Illinois, even with the guards, with everything. It feels different. I don't know if I can really name, what that is exactly, but yeah. But it's the same thing with like and I would say that the men here are much more political than the women, overtly, than the women were in the women's prison. Like, people weren't talking about abolition in the women's prison. People in the prison here at Henry Hill are talking about abolition. They've all read, they've read Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, like they've got their hands on all this material, which wasn't that similar in the women's prison. But as I'm saying, I observed a lot of the classes, and I only taught my own class for a year.
Okay. Are there any final questions or thoughts that anybody would like to share?
What did you share here, Lori? This new brochure? I didn't see that. I'm sorry. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Did you share that?
That's a brochure about Inside Out for anybody who's not familiar with Inside Out.
Yeah.
One of the things that I would like to say for anybody who's interested, we're having a Zoom conversation next week, which will be on Wednesday. It'll be starting at 3:00 Eastern, and it will be Kenny Butler and Joe Schwartz, both of whom are involved in our trainings. They're both formerly incarcerated. They're essentially coaches for our virtual trainings. And what they did was, over the summer, they did together a kind of special research project on our trainings from the perspective of the coaches' involvement, as well as the impact of the coaches on the people getting trained. So I think it'll be a very, very interesting conversation. So just wanted to mention that, and we'll be sending out information. Leanne, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. I hope it was all that you were hoping for.
Thanks, Lori. And I also want to give a shout out to all the students from Atlanta. Really, I think Inside Out will change your life, not to sound so, utopic about it, but I know my students love it. And honestly, Lori, too, that is my favorite class to teach. So I'm so glad I went through your training, and just, it is really transformational. It's really, I love doing the Inside Out class. It's really unique in every single way.
That is nice to hear. Really nice to hear. There's nothing I'd rather be doing. Okay. Why don't we all unmute and give Leanne a hand? Ready?
Thanks, Leanne.
Thank you.
Thanks all for coming. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay. Take
All
care.
right.
Bye-bye, everybody.